Welcome, dear listeners. Today we explore the treacherous allure of love and lust, primal desires that can lead us astray, causing us to forget our morals and chase fleeting fantasies. But as we often see, such indulgences come at a price. Tonight's tale, titled The Alluring Mother-in-Law, illustrates this harsh reality. So sit back, relax, and let the story unfold. Prepare to be captivated. It was moving day for Richard and Susan, who were settling into their daughter Ashley's apartment, along with their son-in-law, Kyle. Initially, the plan was for Susan to stay temporarily, just to help Ashley, who was expecting her first child. However, Kyle and Ashley, wanting to foster a sense of family and provide Richard some company while Susan was away, decided it was best for both parents to move in. After all, a spacious apartment means little without the warmth of loved ones. The reason it was Ashley's parents and not Kyle's was simple. Kyle, hailing from a small town, knew his parents were deeply rooted in their community and wouldn't dream of leaving. He had responsibilities in the city and accepted that his parents wouldn't be moving. Thankfully, Ashley's family understood, putting Kyle at ease. He made sure to visit his folks back home every month or two, partly to ease their longing, but mainly to fulfill his filial duty. The apartment buzzed with activity as Richard and Susan settled in. A lavish spread, including a large pot of stew, adorned the kitchen table. The family had been enjoying their meal, laughter and conversation flowing as freely as the drinks. But beneath the surface, unspoken thoughts and emotions simmered. Except for Ashley, of course, who remained oblivious. Richard, despite his seemingly pleasant demeanor, harbored a deep-seated resentment and insecurity, always measuring himself against others' successes, especially Kyle's. He barely touched the whiskey Kyle offered, taking only a courtesy sip. Susan was a different story. She initially disapproved of Kyle, not seeing him as a suitable match for her daughter, but time had softened her stance, revealing a man of character and ambition. Susan grew fond of Kyle, proud of the life he and Ashley were building. This newfound acceptance brought a lightness to Susan's heart, a desire to indulge in the evening's festivities, including the whiskey. At first, Kyle considered keeping the whiskey to himself. It wasn't just any ordinary drink. It was a potent elixir, rumored to have invigorating effects on men, particularly in certain situations. He'd brought it out primarily to impress Richard, but the older man's obvious disdain, stemming from a deep-seated insecurity, quashed that plan. Susan, on the other hand, was enjoying the whiskey and wanted more. As the potent liquor coursed through Kyle's veins, he felt a stirring within him. Perhaps it was the alcohol, or maybe it was the result of months of pent-up desire due to Ashley's pregnancy. Whatever the cause, Susan's alluring attire that night certainly wasn't helping. Ashley, 3 months pregnant, had already retired to their bedroom. Physical changes and constant discomfort had taken their toll, and she'd excused herself earlier in the evening. Richard, as previously mentioned, was no fan of Kyle's. The sight of his son-in-law and wife laughing and exchanging compliments had irritated him to no end, and he too retreated to the bedroom. Now only Kyle and Susan remained at the table, the remnants of their meal littering the surface. The autumn air, even inside the apartment, held a slight chill, but Susan felt a different kind of heat rise within her. The stew, coupled with the whiskey, had ignited a fire in her belly. She shrugged off her cardigan. The feeling persisted. Unaware that the potent drink was amplifying the effects, she unbuttoned the top few buttons of her blouse, seeking relief. She didn't notice Kyle's gaze fixed on her, his desire growing threefold with each passing moment. A bead of sweat trickled down Susan's elegant neck, disappearing beneath the neckline of her blouse. As the buttons came undone, a glimpse of her cleavage was revealed. Captivated Kyle's attention, drawing his eyes like a moth to a flame. His throat went dry, forcing him to swallow hard, a gesture that did not escape Susan's keen observation. She found herself oddly intrigued by his blatant, almost primal hunger, a hint of amusement playing on her lips. However, as Kyle's stare lingered, showing no signs of abating, Susan began to feel a twinge of guilt and self-consciousness. She cleared her throat, breaking the spell. "Getting late. You should go freshen up and get some rest, Kyle. You have work in the morning, don't forget," Susan said, her voice slightly hoarse. She stood up, adjusting her clothes and ushering Kyle toward the bedroom. "Leave this. I'll take care of it," No need to stay up. She had no idea that her earlier actions, coupled with the whiskey's potency, had unleashed a beast in Kyle, his self-control hanging by a thread. Yet, both were respectable adults, their true desires concealed beneath a veneer of social decorum. Nonsense, Susan. I can help. Besides, it's my day off tomorrow. No need to rush to bed. A real man doesn't let a woman clean up his mess, right? Kyle insisted, his charm on full display. Kyle wasn't successful by chance or sheer luck. He was a driven, ambitious man, charming and quick-witted, with a silver tongue that had secured countless deals for his company. Susan found herself flustered by his words, her defenses crumbling. He had a way of making her feel cherished, respected, even desired. At the same time, he painted a stark contrast between himself and Richard, who suddenly seemed distant and uncaring. Susan stole a glance at the bedroom where Richard lay sleeping, flicker of judgment crossing her features. Turning back to Kyle, she asked, a hint of challenge in her voice, "Are you sure, or are you all talk?" Kyle, sensing he had her hooked, pressed his advantage. "You're right, Susan. Actions speak louder than words. But to win over a woman like Ashley, who inherited all her beauty, intelligence, and grace from you, that takes more than just words." He paused, gauging her reaction. Susan was listening intently, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension on her face. Emboldened, Kyle continued, "You may not believe this, but Ashley and I share the household chores equally. If she cooks, I clean. If she does laundry, I tidy up. I know it's different from how things were done in your generation, but I believe in equality. It's crucial for a healthy relationship. Don't you agree?" Kyle's words struck a chord within Susan, a woman raised with traditional values, where a wife's duty was to serve her husband. She had endured her fair share of hardship and sacrifice throughout her marriage. While happy for her daughter, she couldn't help but feel a pang of envy, a longing for the kind of respect and consideration Kyle offered Ashley. "You're a lucky woman, Ashley, to have found a man like Kyle," Susan replied, a bittersweet smile gracing her lips. It was no secret that Susan, at 42, had been married young, just 19 when she met Richard, and pregnant with Ashley a year later. Their marriage wasn't unhappy, per se, but it lacked the spark, the passion, the true fulfillment that Susan craved. Richard, for his part, had grown distant over the years, their intimacy fading like a distant memory. Kyle, at 26, was everything Richard was not: successful, attentive, and virile. It was no wonder Ashley was drawn to him. As they continued cleaning, their hands brushing against each other, a palpable tension filled the air. Susan felt a blush creep up her neck, a mix of excitement and guilt washing over her. It was as if they were newlyweds, their stolen glances and lingering touches speaking volumes. Far from resisting this unfamiliar intimacy, Susan found herself leaning into it. Never before had she stood at the sink, a man by her side, sharing the domesticity. It was both unsettling and strangely liberating. A sense of dependence, of having a shoulder to lean on, bloomed within her. Though Kyle was simply helping out, Susan remained the primary dishwasher. He stood beside her, drying and putting away the dishes as she washed. The sheer volume of dishes, however, was taking its toll. Susan's shoulders and arms ached with fatigue. She shifted unconsciously, trying to ease the discomfort. Kyle, ever observant, picked up on Susan's subtle movements. It was quick, both physically and mentally. Her discomfort was all the invitation he needed, confirmation of his growing suspicions. The air crackled with unspoken tension, dangerous game of seduction unfolding between them. Both knew their actions were reckless, their unspoken desires a betrayal of trust and family ties. Yet, base instincts, fueled by the potent whiskey and their current proximity, were overriding rational thought. The line between right and wrong blurred as their bodies inched closer. Kyle's gaze lingered on the curve of Susan's neck, his pulse quickening. Susan, meanwhile, felt a wave of confusion wash over her. Her senses were heightened, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was a prisoner of her own longing, her resolve crumbling under Kyle's intoxicating presence. One wrong move, one tempting word, and she knew she wouldn't be able to resist him any longer. "Susan," Kyle said softly, his voice a husky whisper in her ear, "your shoulders seem tense. Are you all right?" He didn't wait for a reply. Kyle's hands reached out, his touch gentle yet firm as he rested them on Susan's shoulders. Yes, a little," Susan breathed, momentarily stunned by his boldness. His touch sent a jolt of electricity through her, a mixture of indignation and forbidden pleasure. Yet his concern, his attentiveness to her smallest discomfort, disarmed her. She melted against his touch, feeling suddenly young and vulnerable, a schoolgirl fighting a losing battle against a powerful crush. Kyle, sensing her surrender, tightened his grip, drawing her closer. He was a skilled predator, slowly reeling in his prey, his touch both possessive and intoxicating. Susan felt trapped, yet a part of her reveled in this dangerous game, her body responding to his touch in ways she couldn't ignore. "Don't worry, Susan. I give great massages. I do it for Ashley all the time after she's had a long day at work." Before Susan could protest, his hands began working their magic, kneading the tension from her shoulders and back. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the feel of his strong hands on her skin. Her breathing grew shallow, each exhale a soft moan of surrender. Susan couldn't even find the words to respond. Kyle's skilled hands, working their magic, were erasing all thoughts of resistance. It was as if Ashley was no longer a barrier, a mere whisper in the back of her mind. Susan's own hands, still wet from the dishwater, slowly stopped their rhythmic movements, her attention fully captivated by the sensations coursing through her body. Her breath hitched in her throat, coming shallow and erratic, as Kyle's touch grew bolder, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her spine. The heat radiating from him, the scent of his cologne, the sheer magnetism of his presence, was intoxicating. Susan found herself leaning into his touch, her head falling back against his chest. Kyle knew he had her. He could sense her surrender in the way her body responded to his touch, her soft gasps barely contained. The whiskey was working its magic, loosening her inhibitions, blurring the lines between what was forbidden and what felt oh so right. Susan was his for the taking, her resistance crumbling with each passing moment. The potent combination of her own desires, fueled by years of neglect and Kyle's undeniable charm, was proving too much to bear. She was caught in a dangerous riptide, and there was no turning back now. As if on cue, Susan's legs began to tremble, her hips subtly swaying against Kyle's. She crossed and uncrossed them restlessly, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control over her traitorous body. Kyle, a keen observer, noticed her discomfort. He knew exactly what that telltale dampness meant. This was his moment, the perfect opportunity to shatter her defenses and claim her as his own. But he didn't rush, not yet. He savored the anticipation, the knowledge that she was teetering on the edge of surrender. He wanted her willing, her resistance a distant memory. "How are you feeling, Susan? Is that better?" he whispered, his lips brushing against her ear. "It's nice," Susan murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She was caught in a haze of desire, her mind struggling to catch up with the sensations flooding her body. "Nice? Or do you need something more?" Before Susan could process his words, she felt his lips on the back of her neck, a searing heat that spread through her like wildfire. At the same time, his hand found her breast, his touch sending a jolt of pleasure and panic through her. "Kyle, we can't, this is wrong," Susan gasped, trying to pull away. But her protests were half-hearted, her body betraying her with its eagerness. "Wrong. Susan, you're like a delicious feast, and I'm a starving man. How can I resist? You have no idea how long I've been wanting you, how incredibly desirable you are. How can you expect me to control myself?" Susan felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. His words, spoken with such raw need and desire, were chipping away at her defenses. "Oh God, Kyle, this is crazy." She felt his hardness pressed against her, his arousal impossible to ignore. "Oh God, Kyle, it's so big." Kyle was relentless, his touch, his words, his sheer presence breaking down her resistance. He had her trapped in a labyrinth of desire, her mind screaming at her to escape, while her body craved his touch. "Kyle, please. What if Richard wakes up? What about Ashley?" Susan pleaded, her voice laced with both fear and excitement. "Don't worry about them, Susan. Just focus on me," Kyle murmured, his lips trailing fire across her skin. The truth was, Susan wanted this, craved it even. Richard's neglect had left a void in her life, a yearning for touch, for passion, for something more. Kyle, with his youth and virility, represented everything she had been missing. She'd convinced herself it was wrong, forbidden, but the flames of desire fanned by Kyle's touch and the potent whiskey were raging out of control. Susan was drowning in a sea of forbidden pleasure, and for the first time in years, she didn't want to be saved. Her resolve crumbled, her body trembling with anticipation as she felt his lips capture hers in a searing kiss. "Oh, God. Kyle, it's so big," Susan moaned, a mixture of fear and excitement in her voice. Kyle continued his relentless assault, his words and actions pushing her further into a dizzying spiral of desire. She felt lost, trapped in a maze with no escape, every fiber of her being yearning for his touch. Even as her mind screamed at her to resist, Susan, caught in the throes of passion and her own unfulfilled desires, grasped at his words like a lifeline. And with that, Susan succumbed to her deepest desires, her inhibitions crumbling like a sandcastle against the tide. Her whispered plea, a testament to her surrender, sent a thrill through Kyle. "Yes, yes, kiss it. I like it, oh God." Her words, barely a gasp, were like gasoline on an open flame. Kyle, emboldened by her eagerness, lost himself in the moment, his control snapping like a dry twig. "God, Susan, you're incredible," he groaned, his voice rough with desire. "Shh, just do it. I need you." Susan whispered, her cheeks flushed with a mixture of shame and excitement. "But be quiet, Ashley, Richard." Her words, a desperate plea to protect their secret, did little to dampen the inferno raging between them. The kitchen, bathed in the soft glow of the pendant light, became their playground, their illicit desires a tangible force that pushed them toward the precipice. Suddenly, just as Kyle was about to take their forbidden tryst further, he pulled back, leaving Susan panting and wanting more. "Wait," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Someone might hear." Susan's heart hammered in her chest, her body thrumming with unfulfilled desire. A wave of fear, of being caught, washed over her. Richard could wake up any minute, or worse, Ashley. "Kyle, please, don't stop," she begged, her voice trembling. She hated her own desperation, the way her body ached for him. Kyle, torn between his own needs and the potential consequences, sought to reassure her. I know, just not here. It's too risky." He knew he was pushing his luck, testing the limits of their forbidden affair. But he was addicted to the thrill, the danger of their secret rendezvous, and the undeniable allure of Susan's surrender. Looking into her eyes, ablaze with a desire that mirrored his own, Kyle knew she wouldn't deny him. Not now. His gaze, intense and possessive, swept over her, igniting a firestorm of need that swept away her last vestiges of resistance. She was his, completely and utterly, and he would have her, no matter the cost. Just then, a noise from the hallway, a floorboard creaking under an unknown weight, shattered the silence. Kyle's heart leaped into his throat. He froze, every instinct screaming at him to hide. He ducked down, instinctively seeking cover behind the kitchen island, while Susan whirled around, her heart pounding in her chest. At that moment, Richard emerged from the hallway, his eyes settling on Susan at the sink. "Still up?" he asked, his tone flat and disinterested. Susan's heart skipped a beat. "Oh, hi, honey, I'll be in soon," she stammered, her cheeks flushed, her voice betraying her guilt. "Well, hurry it up. It's just a few dishes. Some of us have to work in the morning." Richard seemed oblivious to Susan's unusual flustered state, his attention focused on his own discomfort. He was already irritated by the earlier display of affection between his wife and son-in-law, and her lingering in the kitchen only added to his annoyance. He walked past her, heading towards the bathroom, his back to his wife as he muttered under his breath. "And that Kyle? Useless. Lets his pregnant wife do all the cleaning. Some men?" He disappeared into the bathroom, leaving Susan alone with her pounding heart and a growing sense of shame. Relief warred with a strange disappointment. Richard's indifference stung more than she cared to admit. Meanwhile, Kyle, still hidden in the pantry, felt his gaze drawn to a different kind of distraction. Susan, in her haste to cover up their almost encounter, had accidentally tucked her blouse into her pants, leaving a tantalizing glimpse of her smooth, toned stomach. He knelt, unable to tear his eyes away. The sight sent a jolt of desire through him. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the fabric, wanting more. Before Susan could react, he lowered his head, his lips finding her bare skin. "Kyle. Stop. What if Richard?" she hissed, her voice a mixture of panic and pleasure. Her body, however, told a different story. She arched into his touch, a soft moan escaping her lips. "Shh, don't worry, he won't know," Kyle whispered, his voice husky with desire. Her protests were drowned out as a wave of pleasure washed over her. Susan closed her eyes, surrendering to the sensations, her mind a dizzying mix of fear and excitement. Just then, the sound of the bathroom faucet shutting off jolted her back to reality. Her eyes flew open, panic surging through her. Richard was coming back. Susan's eyes fluttered closed, her head spinning as wave after wave of pleasure crashed over her. Kyle's touch, his lips on her skin, ignited a firestorm in her belly, erasing all thoughts but the consuming need he was stoking. She was barely aware of her surroundings, lost in a haze of forbidden desire. Just as she was about to reach the precipice, the sudden sound of the bathroom faucet snapping shut jolted her back to reality. Panic surged through her, replacing the intoxicating haze with a cold dread. Richard! Richard emerged from the bathroom, his gaze sweeping over Susan, who was still desperately trying to regain her composure. He did notice something was different. His wife seemed smaller somehow. But he shrugged it off, his mind already preoccupied with his irritation. You done yet? It's late, he grumbled, walking past her towards the fridge to pour himself a glass of water. Honestly, that Kyle, useless. Some men. He muttered his disapproval loud enough for Susan to hear, oblivious to the real reason for his wife's flushed cheeks and disheveled appearance. His words, intended as a jab at Kyle, were lost on Susan, who was still reeling from their close call, her senses overloaded, a body thrumming with a mixture of desire and fear. To Kyle's surprise, Richard's reappearance didn't dampen Susan's ardor. In fact, her reaction was the opposite of what he expected. Instead of pulling away, she leaned into him, a response more intense, more desperate than before. The moment Richard turned his back, Susan, her voice a breathless whisper, urged him on. Don't stop, Kyle. Don't. And with that, she surrendered to the wave crashing over her, her own desires eclipsing any fear of being caught. Thrill of forbidden pleasure, sharper and more intense than anything she'd ever experienced, coursed through her vein. Her eyes fluttered shut, her head falling back against the pantry door as a wave of ecstasy washed over her, her body racked with tremors of release. Kyle watched in awe and primal satisfaction as Susan, her face flushed, her lips swollen from his kisses, rode out her climax. She was a vision of wanton desire, a woman awakened to her own power. As Richard walked back into the living room, his back to them once again, Susan met his gaze, a knowing smile playing on her lips. He paused, sensing something amiss, but unable to pinpoint exactly what it was. Susan held his gaze for a beat too long, a spark of defiance in her eyes before turning back to the sink, her shoulders shaking with silent laughter. The moment Richard disappeared into the hallway, his footsteps fading into the quiet of the apartment, Susan's legs nearly gave out from under her. She sagged against Kyle, her body drained, yet strangely exhilarated. He held her close, their kiss hungry, desperate, but Kyle knew they weren't out of the woods yet. One wrong move, one creaking floorboard, and their secret would be exposed. They needed to be smarter, more careful. His gaze fell on the bathroom door, a mischievous glint in his eyes. Come on, let's continue this somewhere a little more private. He led her towards the bathroom, his hand on the small of her back, his touch sending shivers down her spine. It was crazy, reckless, but in that moment Susan didn't care. She was Kyle's willing captive, ready to explore the depths of their forbidden desire. Kyle locked the bathroom door behind them, click echoing in the sudden silence. He flipped down the toilet seat, his movements efficient, practiced. Susan watched him, pulse quickening, a mixture of anticipation and apprehension swirling within her. There was no turning back now. Not that she wanted to. The events of the evening, the stolen kisses, the forbidden touches, had awakened a hunger within her, a yearning for something more than the cold comfort of her marriage bed. Part of her, part still clinging to her morals, knew this was wrong, reckless even. But a stronger, more primal urge, fueled by Kyle's touch and her own unfulfilled desires, urged her forward. Kyle caught her eye, a mischievous smile playing on his lips. He could sense her hesitation, the internal battle she was waging. Don't worry, Susan, I'm a man of experience. He chuckled, his voice husky with desire. His words, laced with confidence and a hint of arrogance, ignited a spark of defiance in Susan. He would see just how experienced she was. The small bathroom, usually a place of mundane routine, transformed into a haven of illicit desire. The air crackled with unspoken tension as their clothes fell away, discarded on the bathroom floor like shed skins. Their lovemaking was urgent, desperate, fueled by stolen moments and the constant threat of discovery. Susan, lost in the throes of passion, found herself shedding years of inhibition, her body responding to Kyle's touch with a fervor that surprised even her. Afterward, as they lay intertwined, a wave of guilt washed over Susan. Kyle? What if? She couldn't even bring herself to voice her fear. Don't worry, Susan. It'll be fine. Kyle reassured her, his voice laced with a confidence he didn't entirely feel. I'll take care of it. He meant it too. Whatever it took, Kyle would handle the consequences. Couldn't deny the thrill of their encounter, the forbidden pleasure of Susan's surrender. He was a man who fixed things, and if that meant taking care of a little accident, then so be it. His conscience, however, remained strangely silent. Despite his words, a seed of unease lingered in Kyle's mind. He wasn't a heartless monster, despite what his actions might suggest. Cared about Ashley, in his own way. But he justified his transgression by telling himself that men had needs, that what happened between him and Susan didn't diminish his feelings for his wife. And with that, he pulled Susan back into his arms, their bodies seeking solace and release in the afterglow of their forbidden encounter. Time seemed to slip away as they lost themselves in a whirlwind of passion, the bathroom's cramped confines amplifying their every touch, every stolen breath. 30 minutes later, engulfed in the afterglow of their illicit affair, it seemed as if they were invincible, their love a shield against the outside world. But reality, in the form of a sharp knock on the bathroom door, shattered their illusion. Honey? You all right in there? Ashley's muffled voice, thick with sleep and concern, sent a jolt of panic through both of them. Shit, it's Ashley! Susan gasped, her face draining of color, her heart hammered in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. What do we do? She can't see us like this. Kyle, caught off guard, scrambled for an explanation, his mind racing. Quick, pretend you're sick, he whispered urgently. Get over by the toilet, make yourself throw up. I'll pretend I'm helping you. Right, Susan stammered, her mind a jumble of panic and adrenaline. She stumbled towards the toilet, leaning over the bowl just as Kyle yelled back, Hey Ash, everything's okay. Your mom's a little under the weather. Must be something she ate. He lowered his voice, making it sound as if he was comforting Susan. Can you grab a cool washcloth from the bedroom? Ashley, her sleep-fogged mind struggling to process the situation, mumbled a response and stumbled back down the hallway. Seizing the opportunity, Kyle rushed to Susan's side, helping her to her feet. He straightened his clothes, his heart pounding in his chest. As Ashley rounded the corner, washcloth in hand, she stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes widening in confusion. Susan was slumped over the kitchen sink, her face pale, her hair disheveled. Kyle was beside her, his arm around her shoulders, a look of concern etched on his face. Mom! What happened? Ashley exclaimed, rushing to Susan's side. Oh, honey, I was rinsing my face and got a little dizzy. Fainted, must have hit my head. Susan stammered, putting on a brave face. Richard, hearing the commotion, stumbled out of the bedroom, his eyes bleary with sleep. What's going on? Why are you shouting? He glanced at Susan, then at Kyle, his brow furrowed in confusion. Susan? What's with? Are you only wearing your slip? Oh, this? Susan stammered, her face turning crimson. Kyle jumped in, his voice calm and reassuring. She fainted, Richard. Hit her head pretty hard. Must have been pretty out of it, forgetting things. He shot Susan a warning glance. She needed to regain her composure and fast. Oh, right, of course, dizzy. Richard mumbled, still half asleep. He obviously wasn't paying much attention, more annoyed by the disturbance than concerned about his wife's well-being. He turned to Ashley. Help your mother to bed, Ashley. I'm going back to sleep. Ashley, ever the dutiful daughter, slipped her arm around her mother's waist. Come on, Mom. Let's get you to bed. As they walked away, Kyle gave Susan a reassuring pat on the shoulder. She mouthed a silent thank you, her heart still pounding in her chest. He watched them go, a strange mix of relief and disappointment washing over him. That had been a close one. Way too close. He needed to get a grip, rein in this dangerous attraction before it cost him everything. But as he met Susan's gaze one last time, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and lingering desire, Kyle knew deep down that this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Richard shook his head, dismissing the nagging doubts as he turned and headed back to bed. This had been their closest call yet, their illicit affair dangling by a thread. Susan, now a willing participant in their secret rendezvous, had found a newfound confidence, a recklessness that both excited and terrified Kyle. He knew they were playing with fire, risking their families, their reputations, for stolen moments of pleasure. But the thrill of the forbidden, the intoxicating rush of their clandestine encounters, was addictive. They were caught in a dangerous spiral, their desires threatening to consume them entirely. As the weeks turned into months, their affair continued unabated, their encounters becoming bolder, more daring. Richard, oblivious to his wife's betrayal, continued to be the distant, emotionally unavailable husband he'd always been. His neglect, whether intentional or not, only served to fuel Susan's desire for Kyle, her son-in-law's touch, a constant reminder of everything her husband was not. One afternoon, while Richard was away on a business trip and Ashley was at a prenatal checkup, Kyle found himself drawn back to the apartment, his body aching for Susan's touch. He dropped Ashley off at the clinic, promising to return when her appointment was over. But his mind had other plans. He'd barely stepped foot inside the apartment when he saw her, sitting on the couch, her eyes glued to the television. "Susan," he breathed, his voice husky with desire. Without a word, he closed the distance between them, his arms encircling her, pulling her close. She felt soft, pliant, her familiar scent filling his senses, igniting a firestorm in his blood. What if? Susan started to protest, but her words were cut off as his lips found hers, silencing her doubts with a searing kiss. "Don't worry, Richard's gone for the day and Ashley's at her appointment. We have plenty of time." And with that, they were lost, their bodies moving together as one, their passion a tangible force that consumed them entirely. They did this on the couch, their bodies entwined, oblivious to the world outside their bubble of desire. Time ceased to exist as they explored the depths of their forbidden love, their every touch, every gasp, testament to their reckless abandon. It wasn't until they heard the telltale thud of a bag hitting the floor, followed by the sound of Ashley's muffled sobs, that reality came crashing down around them. Kyle had forgotten all about picking up Ashley from her appointment. He'd been so caught up in the moment, in the intoxicating throes of his affair with Susan, that everything else, including his pregnant wife, faded from his mind. Ashley, meanwhile, had grown increasingly worried. After waiting for over an hour at the clinic, her calls to Kyle going unanswered, she decided to take a taxi home. She felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach, a premonition that something was terribly wrong. The moment she stepped into the apartment, the scene that greeted her sent a wave of nausea through her. There, in the middle of the living room, were Kyle and her own mother, their limbs tangled together on the couch. "Mom? Kyle?" Ashley gasped, her voice a strangled whisper. The sight of her daughter, her face pale with shock and betrayal, jolted Susan and Kyle back to reality. "Ashley!" Susan cried out, scrambling to cover herself. Horror washed over her, sickening feeling in the pit of her stomach. Kyle, his face draining of color, could only stare at Ashley, his mind reeling, unable to process the magnitude of their betrayal. Ashley stood there, frozen in place, her hand instinctively clutching her stomach, as if trying to protect her unborn child from the sight before her. A sharp pain, both physical and emotional, ripped through her. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of their betrayal crashed over her. You. She stammered, unable to articulate the words, her voice choked with sobs. And then, everything went black. Susan and Kyle rushed to Ashley's side, their guilt and fear palpable as they helped her onto the couch. "Ashley, baby, are you okay?" Susan cried, voice thick with panic. But Ashley didn't respond. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow. "We need to get her to the hospital, now!" Kyle shouted, voice tight with fear. They rushed her out the door, their affair momentarily forgotten in the face of a far greater crisis. Ashley, her pregnancy already high risk, went into premature labor shortly after arriving at the hospital. The doctors managed to deliver the baby, a tiny, fragile girl, but Ashley remained unconscious. Kyle sat outside the delivery room, his face ashen, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He'd destroyed everything, his marriage, his family, his unborn child's future, all shattered by his own selfish desires. How could he ever face Ashley, his child, knowing the pain he'd caused? He closed his eyes, the weight of his actions threatening to crush him. Richard, still back in his hometown, received a frantic call from Kyle, the words Ashley, hospital, premature labor, sending a chill down his spine. He raced back to the city, his mind a jumble of confusion and fear. How could this be? Everything had been fine when he'd left that morning. Susan, overcome with guilt and shame, couldn't bear to face her daughter or husband. The reality of their betrayal, the consequences of their actions, crashed down on her like a tidal wave. She knew she'd destroyed everything. Her family, her daughter's happiness, the life she'd built. All shattered by her own selfish desires. That night, while Kyle kept vigil at the hospital, Susan packed a bag and disappeared. She left a note for Richard, a simple, heartbreaking message. "Don't look for me." Ashley eventually woke up, but the light in her eyes had dimmed, replaced by a dull ache of betrayal and heartbreak. She held her tiny daughter, fragile reminder of the life she'd almost lost. Her heart felt empty. She barely acknowledged Kyle, her silence a heavy weight that pressed down on him. Constant reminder of his unforgivable actions. Kyle, racked with guilt and remorse, tried everything he could to make amends. He stayed by Ashley's side, caring for their daughter, hoping that his actions could somehow make up for the pain he'd caused. But Ashley remained distant, her silence a constant reminder of the chasm that now separated them. Richard, finally learning the truth of his wife's betrayal during a heated argument with Kyle, felt a wave of anger and shame wash over him. He was furious with Susan, with Kyle, with himself for being so blind. But his anger was overshadowed by a deep sense of sorrow, of a life and a family irrevocably broken. He stayed long enough to help care for his granddaughter, his heart aching for the innocent life caught in the crossfire of their betrayal. But once the baby was strong enough, Richard returned to his hometown, seeking solace in the quiet familiarity of his childhood home, leaving the shattered remnants of his family behind. And so, dear listeners, our story ends. Cautionary tale of temptation, betrayal, and the devastating consequences of uncontrolled desire. It serves as a reminder that even the strongest bonds can be broken, that the choices we make have far-reaching consequences, not just for ourselves, but for those we love. Let this story be a lesson to us all. Think carefully before you act, before you give in to temptation, for the price of fleeting pleasure can be a lifetime of regret.